tariffs on its imports of Canadian canola oil and meal. Ongoing uncertainty over United States levies adds to canola's woes. The Canadian oilseed is getting support this morning from upticks in Chicago soy oil, along with those in Malaysian palm oil. Declines in European rapeseed plus Chicago soybeans and soy meal are weighing on canola. Slight increases in crude oil are lending some support to the vegetable oils. The Canadian Grain Commission reports canola exports for the week ending March 9th exceed 197,000 tons, about 87% more than the previous week. That brings year-to-date canola exports to 6.32 million tons, compared to 3.44 million a year ago. The Canadian dollar is higher on Friday morning, with the loonie at 69.51 US cents, compared to Thursday's close of 69.4. The U.S. Department of Agriculture announces 2 private sales this morning, with both going to unknown destinations. One is for more than 218,000 tons of old crop corn, and the other is for 20,000 tons of old crop soy oil. The strike by oilseed workers in Argentina has ended, with them agreeing to restart negotiations with the government. CONAB raises the Brazil soybean harvest to 167.37 million tons and bumps up the Brazil corn harvest to 122.76 million tons. France holds its soft wheat at 74% good to excellent. Rotting off prices at the Chicago Board of Trade, soybean futures turned lower on Friday morning. The May contract gives up 4 cents at $10.07 per bushel. May soy oil is up by less than 1/10 of a cent at 41.35 cents per pound. May soy meal is down $3.90 at $303.20 per short ton. Also in Chicago, May corn gives up 7 cents at $4.58 per bushel. May oats dip a penny at $3.69. The U.S. wheat complex is higher as Chicago May tacks on 1.5 cents at $5.64. Kansas City May gains 5.5 cents at $5.93, and Minneapolis May adds 3 cents at $6.07. That's a look at the ICE futures and the Chicago markets for Friday morning, March 14th. For MarketsFarm.com in Winnipeg, I'm Glenn Halleck.
For over 35 years, they've been your go-to for quality farm and snow removal equipment, and they should also be your go-to for parts. At Butler Farm Equipment, their parts department is stocked with batteries, oil, pins, bushings, antifreeze, bearings, belts, pulleys, sprockets, roller chain, hoses, fittings, hydraulic cylinders, and more. Plus, specific OEM parts from New Holland, Schulte, Toro, and Gravely. Butler Farm Equipment, over 35 years of great service in the Peace region. Visit butlerfarmequipment.ca.
The opinions expressed on this show do not represent those of the station. If you've missed any of the shows, you can follow the podcast at Energeticcity.ca. Welcome to This Week in the Peace, a show dedicated to the people, events, and news of BC's Peace region. Here's your hosts, Dub Craig and Steve Berard.
Welcome to This Week in the Peace. Later in the show, we'll chat with a member of the Prince George Fire Center to talk about the lead up to this year's wildfire season and what the preparation and monitoring process looks like in the weeks leading into spring.
All right, but first and related, we're going to be talking to somebody from the BC River Forecast Center. Once a month, they release a little report on how the snowpack is looking around BC. So we're going to talk specifically about that with Jonathan Boyd from the BC River Forecast Center. Good morning, Jonathan, and welcome to the show.
Oh, good morning. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much for taking some time for us today. Why don't we just start kind of, we could even talk broadly if we want to, if we even can in a province as vast as BC. How are things looking compared with last year in terms of sort of snowpack and snow accumulation around the province?
Yeah, really compared to last year, maybe just a little bit better. Last year, the provincial average for all stations across the province was 66% of normal for March 1st. Mm-hmm. So this past couple weeks, we got all the numbers in from the automated stations and the manual snow surveys, and the average came in at 73%. So a little bit higher, but based on each individual region, you might have some doing quite a bit better than last year, and a few areas that are maybe a little bit worse off than last year. 73% is well below normal, and it would be quite unusual. It's just that last year was even lower.
Yeah, and if I remember right, looking at the map specifically, and I'm going to get the region name wrong, so I apologize. Somewhere in the interior, I want to say the Chilcotin. I mean, it was in the red for how low the snowpack is there. But on the opposite side, Peace Liard was at like 97% or something. So really kind of I guess a mixed bag, and really kind of levels things out, eh?
Yeah, certainly. And definitely the northern sections of the province have been healthier so far throughout the entire season. The Chilcotin is quite unique. Unfortunately, there's just a couple stations there at relatively low elevation. So typically March 1st is actually when they peak. They'll often melt in mid-March just because they're such low elevation. So when it comes in at 16% of normal, it was only, I think, maybe like 4 or 5 centimeters were measured at the manual snow survey, and compared to like at that particular station, an average of 20 centimeters, and then the other location didn't have snow at all. So it's not as drastic as if, say, the Vancouver Island or the South Coast or the Upper Fraser was at 17%. It is kind of just within its normal variability that it can be that low for the Chilcotin. But certainly for the Peace, it was coming in at 79% of normal, so above the provincial average, and then the Liard at 98% of normal, and actually the highest for the province.
Yeah. I also wanted to talk a bit about how, and you've already touched on it, how these numbers, how you arrive at that number, right? Because I suppose it really depends on where the automated stations are located and, you know, where people are manually measuring things. I mean, to say that, the snowpack is looking really good in Liard, can you kind of make that blanket statement for the whole region? Or as I say, does it really depend on how kind of the specific stations are looking, and could it be wildly different in another place where maybe it's far from a station?
Yeah, that is where we do have maps associated with the snow bulletin. You can look it up just via our River Forecast Center website. There's a section for the snow, and there's the March 1st bulletin. We have all the bulletins actually dating back to, I think, about 1997 historically. But just in recent months now, we've got a bit more of a thorough mapping to show the exact locations. And the Liard is tricky because it is such a vast and huge basin.
Yeah.
The Snow Basin Index itself is only comprised of 2 sites. So one at Summit Lake and then one at Fort Nelson Airport. So relatively lower elevation locations, and it really is just an average of the snow water equivalent at both of those stations divided by the average of the normal conditions at those locations. It's not necessarily as widespread of measurements as we have in other regions. One being the Peace. The challenge with the Peace as well is that it's inclusive of the Williston Basin. So what actually into Williston Lake there, and it really is because BC Hydro manages and operates the snow network there for the purpose of forecasting for power production. And then in the last 10 years, just with Site C, they have started to put more automated stations now outside of the Williston Basin, upstream of where Site C is. It's just that because they don't have that long of a record, we can't compare it to a normal period of 30 years. So we just have to be patient for the data to eventually come in.
Now, this could be a very broad question, so I apologize if it's even too broad. But I guess my question is, why does this matter, and or why is this important that we could say the Peace at this time last year, we're kind of 10% better than we were, though, as you say, it's still only 79% of kind of what was normally expected. What does it mean when we say that, and what does it mean kind of for the spring melt, and even if we look beyond that to sort of the summer and perhaps even the wildfire season going forward, if it means anything at all in that context?
No, it for sure means a lot in that context as well, and the history of the snow survey program began in the 1930s, and at that time, of course, it was just manual measurements, but it was primarily for the South Coast, and areas of the South Interior, the Okanagan and the Thompson. And it began purely for a water supply issue and making sure that there would be enough drinking water or water for irrigation in the spring, summer, and early fall. The program really amplified after the 1948 floods. That was the last time the Fraser River had a major flood, but the flooding actually happened pretty well all across the province that is susceptible to snow melt related flooding in the spring. And that's just because the optimal conditions happened. It was a really cold spring, April, and the first half of May, and then we had just extreme heat for the last 2 weeks of May. So that really amplified the entire snow program across the province. So one of the major key factors is just to prepare for flood risk. If, say, the snowpack, and it can be where it's 150% above normal or even higher, we know that there's going to be a greater potential for flooding. You still need to have the most optimal conditions in terms of the melt situation, cold for a while, followed by extreme heat. Eventually, we started having more stations being built in areas where there's reservoirs. I mentioned BC Hydro has a lot in the Williston. There's a lot in the Nechako that are run by Rio Tinto. So that's based on energy production and just reservoir management side of things. And then, of course, with the snowpack, we get an idea of flood, but we also have an opportunity to understand the drought situation. And if the snowpack is low, it gives us a heads up that the upcoming year can be challenging from a water availability perspective. And oftentimes drought and wildfire go hand in hand. It's not necessarily a guarantee. It's not always that just because the snowpack is low, we will have a drought or wildfire. So much depends on the spring weather conditions, a combination of how rapid it melts, and then also whether we eventually get the precipitation that, for, say, the Fort St. John area, the wettest months of the year are that May, June, and early July period.
Okay, so it could be good news. It's sort of what we're kind of saying, because I know, especially looking at Liard, and we think about wildfires that impacted Fort Nelson last year. And our second guest is going to be from the Wildfire Service. We're going to talk a bit about how those holdover fires are already smoking a bit, because they've been smoldering underground. So, this could have an impact on that. Could have. It's sort of a reserved, I guess, way of looking at it, I suppose, Jonathan?
Yeah, it's definitely better in the north compared to other areas of the province right now. But the challenge, of course, with those holdover fires is that the fires, and specifically the drought side of the situation, goes back now almost 3 years.
Yeah.
And I've been doing this as one of my main gigs for 8 years now. So I follow each of the bulletins quite closely, and 2022 was a year where it was almost like a spring didn't happen. We just stayed in winter and finally got the melt happening in late June, July. But in 2022, the rains just stopped. I think it was like July 5th. We had a rainstorm, and then after that, we didn't really get rain for the province for about 3 or 4 months, and that pushed us into a late season drought in 2022. That held over through the winter, and then 2023 was, of course, the big wildfire season, and that was triggered. The snowpack was kind of normal-ish. It wasn't necessarily dramatic one way or the other, but we had a very, very hot May, and that rapidly melted the snow and just pushed us into these extreme conditions that lasted throughout the summer. Last year, based on the climate, the precipitation, the rate of melt, it wasn't that bad. It's just that we still had the lingering effects of 2023. So certainly the wildfire was still challenging. The drought side of things were still challenging. I know that the BC energy regulator had suspended water withdrawals from oil and gas companies from rivers and lakes for much of the season last year. So at least we're not following up a dramatically low year of precipitation like we were the previous year, but so much will depend on the precipitation. And one of the most unfortunate things is oftentimes drought, because we get so much precipitation that it floods. And that's what we're also always worried about in the spring, thinking back to 2016 with Dawson, when the wraparound low pressure system caused severe flooding in the region in June of that year, or just the same type of storm system occurred in 2013. It was a little further south, and that was when Calgary got flooded quite badly. Mm-hmm. So we of course want the rain, but we want like spurts of rain every couple of weeks to just sort of replenish the water supply, but not pour everything out at once.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Jonathan, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you for taking some time to share your expertise with us today. I appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome. And the next one, the April 1st one, is the bulletin that we really measure every year from. So,
okay.
Yeah, stay tuned for that one next month.
Absolutely. We'll have to check in again. Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Okay, yeah, you're welcome.
All right, that's Jonathan Boyd from the BC River Forecast Center. We'll be right back with Steve's talk with the BC Wildfire Service right after this on This Week in the Piece.
This is your moment to rise. Join us for 2 powerful days at the 2025 Spark Women's Leadership Conference on October 8th and 9th. Attend in person or via live stream and connect with incredible speakers, dynamic workshops, and a community of women ready to rise. Now through March 16th, celebrate International Women's Day with exclusive savings. Save $80 on in-person registration or get the live stream experience for just $80. Register now at sharingthespark.com.
Help create positive and long-lasting impacts in Fort St. John and the surrounding area. The Child Development Center is currently involved in a large capital campaign in order to purchase and renovate a home that will provide additional programming and supports for children and youth with specific needs in the region. The goal for the campaign is to raise $500,000. Sponsorships opportunities are available, including naming of the home, rooms, and other various recognition options. For more information and to donate, please visit cdcfsj.ca.
Think you know your country music? Tune in at 2:50 every weekday afternoon to play Reverse That Song. We'll be giving away $50 every week to the Great Canadian Oil Change. And all you have to do is tell us what song is reversed by calling the Fort City Chrysler line, 250-787-2222. Reverse That Song on 100.1 Moose FM. Brought to you by the Great Canadian Oil Change.
Straight, your one-stop provider for pipeline and facility construction, fabrication services, coatings, facility turnarounds, and maintenance. We love to build, locally owned, and a proud supporter of the oil and gas industry. Come see us at our office on the Old Fort Road or on the web at straight.ca.
Get ready for a night of unstoppable laughter at the Lido on March 22nd. Join them for Damn Cold Comedy, featuring the hilariously absurd Simon Glassman, whose storytelling leaves audiences in stitches. Dustin Searcy brings his playfully sarcastic charm, having delighted fans nationwide. And don't miss Nick Von Dub, who swapped the oil fields for punchlines and never looked back. Doors open at 7 p.m. and the laughter kicks off at 8. Secure your tickets now at thelido.ca at Experience Comedy Gold.
Moose Country weather.
Today, we're going to see periods of light snow, high to -10, feels like -15. Mainly cloudy tonight, 30% chance of light snow overnight, a low of -18, feels like -28. Tomorrow, periods of light snow, high to -10, feels like -18. And Sunday, periods of snow, high of -7.
You can watch this show live on Facebook. Catch the replays at Energeticcity.ca or be part of the show by texting your thoughts to the Fort City Chrysler line at 250-787-2222.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Steve. Spring is nearly here, which means it's almost time for the start of the 2025 wildfire season. The BC Wildfire Service and Prince George Fire Center, responsible for managing fires in the Northeast, have reported that some holdover fires from last year are already producing visible smoke. I sat down yesterday with the Prince George Fire Center's communications assistant, Pedro Roldan-Delgado, to talk about what the weeks leading up to the start of wildfire season look like. Thank you so much for your time today, Pedro. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for having me.
So first and foremost, for people who are maybe new to the region, new to living in an area like BC where there is a wildfire season, what is a holdover wildfire?
Yeah, so I'm just going to go into explaining it here real quick. So in some fuel types, the existing wildfires can move underground and slumber throughout the winter months, and then they can resurface the following spring. So these fires is what we call holdover or overwinter fires. They burn deep underground into the organic matter on the forest floor.
Okay, so in the last weeks of winter, I know that there was a press release from BC Wildfire Service a couple of days ago now, where they mentioned that some of those wildfires are now producing visible smoke in some areas. What does the process look like for actually identifying holdover wildfires and tracking them?
Yeah, so with that, when the snow begins to fall and the ground freezes, the fires become dormant, like I mentioned earlier. So their heat signatures become less easy to detect. So this makes it a bit difficult for the wildfire crews to locate and action any of the hotspots until they actually flare up. So with that being said, through the winter, visible heat signatures and visible fire activities are infrequent and difficult to detect due to overcast, foggy, and snowy conditions. So we just wait until they start flaring up and we can see them again.
Okay, for sure. One of the things that was mentioned in that press release was there was a bit of talk of, I believe it was patrolling flights where they're kind of going over the area. Tell me a little bit about what that process looks like.
Yeah, so we do have a few tools to help identify and track these holdover fires. Some of the methods that we use is, like you mentioned, air patrols, as well as ground patrols, thermal imaging scans, and the use of heavy equipment. So with ground and air patrols, they could be conducted to look for smoke and or heat. So the ground patrols focus mostly on identifying the smoke plumes, and they can be completed by staff from areas with good visibility of the air patrols. They look for smoke plumes as well, but they can use thermal imaging to locate the heat signatures as well.
Okay, for sure. So right now, or at least as of earlier today, I'll have to double check the list, but right now all fires in, I believe, the entire province, but at least within our area, are labeled as under control. What is the difference between a wildfire that's considered under control versus one that's considered being held?
So yeah, it's a good question here. So under control, at this stage, suppression efforts have ensured that the wildfire will not spread beyond the current perimeter. BC Wildfire Service may continue to patrol the fire and extinguish hotspots while moving gear, equipment, and personnel to other incidents. While being held is somewhat similar, but it's at this stage, the wildfire is projected based on fuel, weather conditions, and resource availability to remain within the current perimeter, control line, or boundary. At this point, crews may finish establishing control lines, conduct fuel management activities, and mop up, so that'd be extinguishing a fire after it's been brought under control.
Right, okay. So I want to take a second and maybe compare this year to around the same time in 2024 as we're kind of in the lead up to wildfire season. We're not quite there yet. I think it's literally still snowing outside right now, at least up here. Compared to 2024, how many holdover wildfires are there now? How many were there at this time last year? How many are there now?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't have the numbers. I couldn't grab that number for what we had last year. But just to talk about where we are at this stage, it's still unfortunately a little too early to know the extent of our holdover fires compared to last year, just because we're still continuing to patrol and looking for the holdover areas. So like I mentioned, we won't be noticing the holdovers from last year's popping up this year until they do pop up. So right now, we can't really compare. So even if I did have the numbers from last year, they wouldn't be accurate due to the holdover fire still being dormant in some locations.
Sure. Would you actually then be willing to give me sort of, obviously it's broad strokes, and like you said, we're still very early days. One of the things that I noticed while going over some of our other coverage is that the snowpack this year is a lot more compared to last year across the province, but even in our region, specifically the Peace, there's a lot more snowfall that we've gotten this year compared to last year. Would you say that our outlook right now is looking sort of in a better position in terms of wildfires, a worse spot than last year, or about the same?
So yeah, with the snowpacks, the drought levels still remain elevated. So the drought situation has eased somewhat as compared to last year. Also, field measurements are indicated to close to average snowpack, like you mentioned, for the areas of concerns, which is an improvement from last year. Although it is not certain that it could result in a situation being somewhat better than last year, as this could change depending on the weather over the next few weeks.
Yeah.
So yeah,
for sure.
like you mentioned, a little broad strokes, but yeah, we're very weather dependent when it comes to stuff like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And things can definitely change sort of day to day, week to week.
Exactly.
One thing that I wanted to ask about, I remember last year there were area restrictions for travel, and then eventually there were restrictions for open air burning. There were campfire bans occasionally. What does the timeline look like for is that something that's going to happen on a set schedule, or do those just kind of are they implemented as they're needed? What does it look like for implementing those?
So yeah, so restrictions usually don't come into effect consistently every year. Again, they are weather dependent on what the fire weather index are showing. So for example, since our fire center last year was in severe drought conditions, we did have to implement those fire prohibitions and restrictions earlier in the year. But again, it's all weather dependent on what we're going to be seeing within the next couple months.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. If anybody is out and about in sort of the last couple of weeks of March here, first couple of weeks of April, they're outdoors and they see a plume of smoke or something that could be indicative of a wildfire, how can people go about reporting something like that?
Great question. Yeah, so to report a wildfire or any kind of like campfires that are unattended or even burning violations, you can call the 1-800-663-5555 or star 5555 on your cell phone. We also do have a good wildfire app now available, and you can report a fire that way as well. It lets you upload a photo. And if you happen to be out of service, it will send out the report as soon as you get that service. So they're great tools to have and great numbers for people to remember.
Okay, awesome. Is the process for that any different in a time like right now when we're technically not in the wildfire season, or is it still exactly the same?
Still the exact same. So yeah, if you notice any smokes, it could be something that we're aware of, but it doesn't hurt for people to report because again, it could be something we're not aware of. We have a huge area in the Prince George Fire Center, so the more people can report, the better we can get ahead of these fires.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. For people who maybe they have not seen a wildfire, but they want to keep an eye on the situation as it develops over the coming weeks and as we start to get into wildfire season, where can people go to learn more? Where can people go to keep an eye on the situation?
So yeah, our public website, I'll send you the link via email if you want to add that to your website as well.
For sure.
It's a great source of information for that. So it has links to our active wildfire map. So it'll show you all the active fires within the province, but you can also customize it to show you the locations that you're in, as well as link to blog posts. So that has the latest news within the whole organization, BCWS. So any information, bulletins, restrictions, and as well as another link showing the current bans and restrictions in place. Also, a great source of information for educational videos is our YouTube channel, and I'll send the link as well. We have tons of videos there talking about different stages of wildfire, how we implement the fire weather index for manning campfires and all that stuff, and talking about holdovers. So the YouTube is a great source of information for people just to click on a quick video to educate themselves about wildfires.
Okay, for sure. Awesome. I think that's everything I wanted to go over today. Is there anything else you want to add while we still have you here?
No, yeah, just to remember that number for the reporting any violations for campfires. I'll say it again, the 1-800-663-5555 or star 5555. And as well, just going to shout out to the YouTube channels. I know the people were making great videos, content, some stuff that's great for public to know and just to educate themselves a bit more.
Okay, awesome. Thank you again, Pedro. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, no, anytime. Thank you. Have a good day.
That was Pedro Roldan-Delgado from the Prince George Fire Center. Thanks again to Jonathan Boyd from the River Forecast Center for joining us today on This Week in the Peace, and thank you for tuning in.
You can listen to this show again by checking out the podcast at Energeticcity.ca/podcast. You can listen to previous episodes and, of course, future episodes there as we make them. And while you're there, make sure you check out our other locally produced podcast, award-winning podcast, I should say, called Before the Peace. That's our show. I'm Dub Craig.
And I'm Steve Berard. Be well.
Join us again next Friday morning at 10 for another edition of This Week in the Peace, your weekly talk show dedicated to the people, events, and news of BC's Peace region. Or you can listen to this podcast again at Energeticcity.ca. Do you have something positive you'd like to share with the community?